thank you so much for being at our panel event this morning on traffic reduction. We're really delighted to have you here, especially with the amazing panel lineup that we have for you to dive into the details of how we can reduce traffic levels across the UK in a fair and equitable way. Transport is the highest emitting sector in the UK. It's accountable for roughly a third of emissions, and of those, cars make up about 40%, making it one of the highest emitting subsectors in the UK economy. The government advisory body, the Climate Change Committee, recommends that in order to meet our climate targets in the transport sector, alongside other actions, we also need to reduce the level of traffic we have. Now, there's a lot of other benefits to reducing traffic levels aside from emissions. Hopefully you can see the shared screen there. So for example, we have improved health. There is a potential £2.5 billion in health benefits from shifting under 2% of car journeys to active travel options like walking and cycling. There are improved mobility benefits for low-income households, lower congestion rates. So reducing traffic congestion could save UK drivers billions of pounds a year. In 2018, the cost of traffic congestion was almost £8 billion, which is equal to roughly £1,300 per driver on the road. We will see better air quality, so cutting road miles will help to reduce the 36,000 early deaths caused by air pollution in the UK each year. And while transitioning to EVs will reduce emissions from tailpipe, tyre and brake wear on cars is actually expected to account for 10% of the UK's particulate emissions by 2030. We'll also see lower embedded emissions. So fewer cars on the road obviously means the need for fewer new roads and road building, which cuts the embedded emissions associated with construction. So the government has somewhat already started moving in the direction of improving active travel and public transport options for people across the UK. For example, last year, the Gear Change programme was launched, and that wants to see half of all journeys in towns and cities being cycled or walked by 2030. The Bus Back Better strategy, that's a mouthful, is encouraging people to choose buses instead of cars. And the recent transport decarbonisation plan that was published a couple of months ago explicitly says that it wants public transport and active travel to be the natural first choice for our daily activities. And this is really encouraging rhetoric, but there's more we need to do, and there's a big opportunity for this to go much further. So the panel today is going to explore how we can build a stronger case for shifting away from car travel. We're going to look at the steps that national and local government can take to make this a reality, and how we can achieve traffic reduction in a fair and equitable way that works for everybody. And I'm delighted to introduce our panelists this morning. We have Leo Murray, Director of Innovation at Possible. We have Dr. Kay Inckle, who is a Campaigns and Policy Manager at Wheels for Wellbeing, and Dr. Stephen Joseph, a visiting professor at the University of Hertfordshire's Smart Mobility Research Unit. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first panelist, Leo, for his opening remarks. Over to you, Leo.
Thanks so much, Helena. So I am interested in this because so Possible, if you don't know what we do at Possible, we're a climate change charity. What we're focused on is where people meet decarbonisation, and travel is absolutely integral to people's lived experience, and we try to focus on the positive. So we're very solutions oriented, and that tends to draw us towards climate solutions that have a lot of co-benefits. So co-benefits is a bit jargony, basically other benefits, so things that help to tackle climate change also improve people's lives today. And transport is a sector where emissions have not fallen. So they've not fallen basically since the 1990 baseline. They've fluctuated a little, but gains in one area have been wiped out by increases in another. And essentially emissions haven't gone anywhere at all since 1990. And since I've been looking at this for the last couple of years, it's pretty clear that the fundamental reason for this is that no politicians of any stripe have been prepared to even begin the process of reversing the dominance of the private car over our transport systems. So yes, it's brought a lot of benefits. Increases in car ownership have brought lots of benefits, social benefits, but they've also had a lot of negative consequences. And when you look at the problem in the transport sector and the likely suite of solutions, well, actually, when it comes to co-benefits, reducing traffic, we've just seen that slide from Green Lights. Helena's just showed us a slide around the potential benefits. And, these are really concentrated in places where the negative externalities of relying on private car use are most concentrated. So, there are no cities in the UK that have no major cities in the UK that have legally compliant air quality. So everybody is breathing toxic air, and that's primarily as a consequence of motor traffic, not exclusively, but mainly. But we've seen all of those other aspects of the downsides of relying on private cars as the main way that we get around. So it's really clear that in cities, even if climate change wasn't a thing, which of course it is, but if it wasn't, you still would not want people traveling around in densely built up areas by private car. So, in London, 6 out of 10 trips in private car just made alone by one person driving in a car with 5 empty seats. So this isn't just a sort of subjective thing either. So the Committee on Climate Change, interestingly, in their net zero, when they recommended that the government adopt a net zero target and move from the 80% cut that we had previously enshrined in law, one of the things that they did was they commissioned modelling into socioeconomic benefits of different approaches to mitigation. And modal shift away from private car use actually ranks highest. It delivers the most socioeconomic co-benefits of any action on climate change. So I think that's what's sort of drawn me into this area. The more I've looked at it, the more I've had to conclude that overall traffic reduction, so a reduction in vehicle miles driven in the UK, is an absolute non-negotiable for meeting our climate change targets. And this is true when you just look at the numbers. So if you look at the level of EV uptake that would be required, the speed, the pace and scale of that change of switching to electric vehicles, switching every one of the UK's 32 million cars to electric, actually, and then where do we need to be in terms of emissions in 2030 to stay on track for net zero? These are heroic assumptions about levels of EV uptake if we aren't also doing some things to reduce the overall levels of traffic. So it's a sort of cold hard fact when you just game out the numbers, that the levels of EV uptake which we actually have policies in place to deliver, and which we expect to see, are not high enough to make enough emissions go away from the transport sector to be where we need to be in 2030. So we're going to need to reduce the overall miles that are being driven by internal combustion engine vehicles over the next 10 years. So the exact amount by which we need to reduce it is open to debate, and it's obviously dependent on a lot of other factors. But the overall vehicle miles driven in the UK have risen in almost every year since the Second World War. So just reversing that trend is a profound change. It means doing things very, very differently from what we've done in the past. So this is true when you game out the numbers, but it is also true just in principle. And I was struck by, if you just take an engineering perspective to the problem solving around emissions from the transport sector, well, the Institution for Mechanical Engineers published a paper a couple of years ago called their transport hierarchy. So it's around, if you're trying to improve the sustainability of transport, what is the hierarchy in which you ought to approach that? And the very first thing, the top of the hierarchy, is demand reduction, because it works very, very reliably. The best way to reduce the environmental impact of a trip is to not make that trip. And so the first thing you do is look at what trips don't need to take place. So, there are some sort of very obvious examples like empty Uber miles, for instance. But actually, one of the things the pandemic has done for us is kind of make us revisit which trips are necessary and which trips aren't. So, that's literally the top of the list. And it is only then Second is modal shift, so shifting away from an unsustainable mode and towards a more sustainable mode. The third is system efficiency, and that means improving the carbon impacts of a mode. So that third item on the IMEC transport hierarchy, that is fundamentally the only strategy. It's almost the only strategy. It's the core strategy for decarbonising transport that the government has adopted. So that, unfortunately, you know, I served on the Net Zero Transport Board of Civil Society Advisors alongside Stephen in helping the Department for Transport to craft the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. And although there are a lot of good things in the TDP as published, there, you know, there's lots of good stuff in there, especially around active travel. What is missing is an explicit acceptance. So, you know, like Helena said, she quoted from it, you know, there's some lines and there's some rhetoric around, you know, making walking and cycling and public transport the first choice for short trips. Fine. But actually what there isn't is any acknowledgement of the role of demand reduction in delivering these targets. So there is no plan there's no commitment to reduce traffic miles driven, and it's just not given the treatment that, you know, whereas on the one hand it's the top of the hierarchy from an engineering perspective, you know, actually, you know, what I would argue is that it's political economy. That's why ministers have sort of managed to be impervious to this message, which I know they heard from a whole range of different advisors who they asked to contribute to the process of drafting the plan. They heard demand reduction is going to be needed. And then that's just not expressed in the plan as published. So I think that's the key thing where this is going to have to give. So I think I'm probably out of time, Helena. So let's call that my opening salvo. Thanks.
That's all right. Thank you, Leo. Okay, we're going to head over to Kay next.
Thank you. And can I have my slides, please? Lovely, thanks very much. So my name's Kay Inckle. I'm Campaigns and Policy Manager for Wheels for Wellbeing. We're a disabled people's cycling organisation. And we provide cycling sessions and campaign to access for cycling for disabled people as part of an ethos of mobility justice. Mobility justice demands that mobility and transport infrastructure and provision is targeted towards those who have the least mobility options. And currently that's disabled people, people of colour, low-income families, and targeting towards them rather than the groups, both regionally and demographically, who already have the most mobility privilege. And that is where most of our resources currently go. So if we're to think about reducing traffic and what that might mean, one of the key things of that is reducing private car use, and especially for short journeys. And disabled people in our organisations often fiercely defend the right to private car use. And some of this will remain inevitable and necessary. Some disabled people will need to use cars. However, there are a range of other reasons why disabled people rely on cars. Next slide, please. Thank you. So number one, pavements. Pavements are often inaccessible and impassable for people who use any kind of mobility aid or have any kind of limitation in terms of their mobility or sensory capacity. So trying to navigate a pavement with sticks, wheels or assistance animals is often impossible. This is because of the lack of cut curbs and lack of tactile paving, poor surface quality, camber, problems with width, pavement parking, street clutter, and then street furniture, which has exploded exponentially since the pandemic and rendered pavements impassable for many disabled people. Number two, cycle paths, or perhaps better named bike channels, as they are very often incredibly narrow, and they're designed on the basis that it's an able-bodied person who is cycling a two-wheeled bicycle. Cycle infrastructure is therefore designed on the assumption that everybody can dismount from their bicycle, lift, push or walk with it and manoeuvre it around any kind of obstacles, be that gates that block access into off-road cycling, roadworks or other infrastructure. Now, the government produced LTM 120, which of course addresses many of these issues and has very high standards for cycle design provision. But sadly, this is not always adhered to, and this has certainly been the case with a lot of the pop-up infrastructure during the pandemic. Number 3, so-called public transport. So most public transport seems to have been designed on the basis that only one disabled person ever travels at a time, and that they are always accompanied by a non-disabled person. It tends to be assumed that disabled people do not need to commute, to take the kids to school, attend important meetings or events, or that disabled people would need to be able to work in transit, access refreshments, or even a toilet. It's assumed that disabled people don't need to travel spontaneously, so therefore if you want to use the train and require assistance, you have the luxury of being able to book that at least 24 hours in advance, and then very often it still doesn't show up anyway. Or that disabled people can wait as successive buses pass them by because the access space is blocked, or the ramp is not working, or people won't move their buggies out of it, and so on. And again, that might be possible in London, where buses come every few minutes, but in the rest of the country, where you're lucky if you get 2 buses an hour, that's a complete impossibility. There's also often issues about what mobility aids disabled people are allowed to bring on public transport, and that can very often be at the discretion of a bus driver, station, or other assistance staff. So there's absolutely no certainty or reliability or efficiency of public transport for disabled people. So how do we make public transport an attractive option to disabled people? Well, I guess obviously fix all of the above. But I think we also need to think about public transport that has a huge range of flexi space. So we're talking about spaces on buses and trains that can accommodate a variety of mobility aids, including different kinds of cycles, but also wheelchairs, mobility scooters, as well as allowing parents with buggies, people with baggage, and all other kinds of equipment to travel comfortably and safely. Public transport needs to be easily and instantly accessible if disabled people are going to use it. So it requires some quite radical changes in how we think about disabled people moving around on public transport and what disabled people are moving with. And I suppose the last point that I want to make in this moment is about electric vehicles and how much of a solution they offer. So next slide, please. So with electric vehicles, obviously tailpipe emissions are only part of the problem in terms of the pollution they cause. There's the particulates from braking, there are issues around the battery technology, and also a huge part of a car's carbon footprint is its manufacture. So if we move to a mass transition to electric vehicles, we're creating problems in other areas. But for disabled people, electrification causes a whole range of other problems, because electric charging infrastructure, as you can see from the images, is simply not accessible. None of this has been designed for disabled people to be able to use and to charge an electric vehicle using public charging infrastructure. And many of the ways in which people are charging from their homes involve cables trailing across pavements and causing further hazards to accessibility and trip hazards. There are also currently no wheelchair adapted vehicles that are electric either. So simply suggesting a move to electric vehicles is certainly not the answer for disabled people, or certainly not in the current configuration. And seeing the rollout of electric vehicles has been particularly disappointing because they are by their nature automatic and therefore drivable by a wider range of the population, and yet all the infrastructure that's going in around them is simply not accessible. So again, we see disabled people simply being designed out of transport infrastructure. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kay. That was really informative. Just to remind everybody, if you want to stick your questions in the Q&A box, thank you. There's a couple in there already. And I'm going to hand over to Stephen.
Thank you very much. And I'll try not to duplicate what others have said. What I thought I would say is to try and be positive and optimistic about the possibility of actually cutting traffic. And because of where the University of Hertfordshire is, on cutting traffic outside cities, because it's often said, anybody who's ever seen any commentary on any media whatsoever and looked at the below the line comments on transport, it's always, well, that's all very well, but outside London and the big cities, you have to own a very big SUV to get around at all because there's no other alternative. And I'd like to say that's not true, or doesn't need to be true, is the most important point. Leo slightly talked down the transport decarbonisation plan because, as I think Gillian Annable, who's on I saw on this call, has pointed out, there's a sort of warp and weft. There's a green and a blue bit to it. I think that's how she put it, so there are bits that there is an ambition to cut traffic in urban areas and to stabilise it elsewhere. And what I'd want to do is to take that at its word and suggest where we might go with that. So I've got a few headings for that. The first thing I think is to talk about the role of spatial planning, because that's one of the places where we're building in car dependence at the moment. We're creating development that can only be served by car. I'm involved in the Transport for New Homes project, which has done a lot of work on this and is producing an update report in the next month or two on what's been happening. And in some cases, some of the developments it looked at before have got worse, in that there's no local facilities, there's no local public transport. Walking and cycling are actively discouraged. But there are also some developments which have got better and which show what can be done with new or refurbished housing developments to make them much more accessible. So spatial planning is one of those areas. Secondly, we need to, and this is a sort of short-term thing, we need to target commute. We can target commuting. The decarbonisation plan talks about a commute zero initiative, and that builds on work done by LiftShare with its Mobilityways program, which has shown that you can aim for, you can reduce single occupancy car use. I would say, because I've been around this area a bit, this is reinventing workplace travel plans, but with much better data and involvement. And some of it is very short, can be very short term indeed. And it links with another ambition in the decarbonisation plan, which is to increase vehicle occupancy. Work done by Gillian Annable and others as on shared vehicles has shown the potential for that. So that, and the reason I'm emphasising that is that some of that's short term. You don't have to follow Peter Kay and go for the car share option, but that kind of idea of getting employers to promote car sharing and a reduced and more public transport seems, and better access for pedestrians and cycles. There are some business parks where you really, really can't get there as a pedestrian, or you have to walk across huge car parks to do it. These things can be fixed. So targeting commuting as a short-term issue seems an important thing. My third point is about public transport and active travel, and really about holding the government's feet to the fire on the funding it's already committed on buses and active travel particularly, and to do that in the spending review, and to make to add to that funding, because some of its ambitions for active travel and for public transport will need more money, as the likes of the Urban Transport Group and others have pointed out. I just comment on Kay's points. A lot of public transport is really, really terrible, not just for disabled people, but for anybody who's got any luggage or any kind, or children, or anything that really makes, that isn't, that gives them, makes mobility more difficult. But it can be better. And I'd point to, for example, the new trains coming in on the Merseyrail network, which are level access at all stations, the staff at all stations, And there's no reason why that shouldn't be the norm. And Greater Anglia have also got level access on some of their new trains with platforms that come out from the train to the platform automatically, and they're adjusting the platforms accordingly. So it can be better. I'd argue that devolution to city regions and local transport authorities produces better results. Just one example, Transport for Greater Manchester has a design panel which includes people with different disabilities of all sorts, which are used, and they use that panel in vetting the new Mersey, extensions to and adjustments to the Metrolink tram network, on the basis that if it'll work for them, it'll work for everybody. So there is good practice out there. It's just not widespread, and the national rail network doesn't do it itself any favors on that. But so funding for public transport and active travel is critical. The costs of transport, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan pointed this out itself, and then didn't say anything about what it was going to do about it, that the costs of public transport have been rising, the fuel duty has been frozen, and so the relative costs of public transport have been rising compared with motoring, and outside London, integrated ticketing that allows you to get on different buses by different operators or on different modes is treated as a premium product under the Competition Act rather than as something that is actually the norm. So we need to we can fix those things and make public transport much better. My next point, the roads programme. There's a lot of people, Transport Action Network have been seeing the Department for Transport over the carbon aspects of the decarbonisation plan, but I think there's now a much broader consensus that about the need to reform what we do on roads to stop us building big car-dependent roads and carbon-generating road schemes. There was a very good report produced 2 days ago by the No Place Left Behind Commission from Create Streets, which is not an environmentalist NGO. Its director is involved in the office of, chairs the Office of Place. And they talked about putting roads on a diet, of moving the roads programme to taking out dual carriageways and making roads more people friendly. And I think that points us in the direction of reforming roads planning, as that report suggested, and reforming national highways, as Highways England's latest incarnation is, so that it actually focuses on people rather than vehicles, and promotes shared and high occupancy vehicles, including buses and coaches, on its network, rather than making it really difficult in some cases for buses to get across their network. I said we can do this outside cities. The University of Hertfordshire did some round tables last year. The report is coming out shortly, which showed some real ways forward on exactly what you can do. It concluded, for example, that e-bikes are a game changer outside cities if given the right priority, that mobility hubs that bring together different transport options at anything up to from village halls up to more organized places, that demand responsive transport, but also conventional transport. We looked at what Cornwall has been doing in terms of providing a much better and integrated public transport network, though that's still work in progress. But the sense was, if Cornwall can do this, then lots of other places can do it. I just make two other points. Firstly, lots of people are now saying this. I've mentioned the No Place Left Behind a report that creates streets, and what that was saying. I should give a plug, since I see Claire Haig is on the call, to the Greener Transport Council, which will shortly be issuing a manifesto on this with a lot of academic and other support. These are, there's a lot of consensus around this. and about the need to reform the costs of transport and to move to, because of the loss of fuel duty from the move to electric vehicles, to move towards a much better and fairer system of road user charging as well. So I think that's more than enough. My opener. I hope that those comments are those starting comments are useful. I suppose my comment is that alternatives to single occupancy car use can be much better. I've noticed comments already in the Q&A about some of the shortcomings of Greater Anglia Trains. My point was simply that they've done something about making level access part of the story. I see Kay shaking her head. Does that mean, I don't know if that means she's disagreeing with me, but some train operators have done better than others, is all I'd say. But we can have that discussion a bit later on. So but my final point, we've got a system which generates car dependence, and car dependence is bad for people with cars who have to drive a lot further. Ask anybody who's got small kids and has to drive them around places, as opposed to the vision that Chris Borden and others have for independent mobility for children. And for people without cars, there is there is transport poverty in this country, where people don't travel at all because they can't, because of disability and other reasons, but also because they simply can't afford it. The public transport isn't there, that alternatives to cars, sometimes even taxis aren't there because there isn't, the taxi drivers can't provide it, simply can't make a living out of it. In places like rural Essex and Suffolk, for instance, there sometimes just aren't taxis there at all. So we need to look at social inclusion for transport, and that a social justice view of how we get to net zero. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And Kay, I can see you wanted to respond to something Stephen said there, so feel free to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of points. The first, I agree that if you design public transport that is fully accessible for disabled people, it becomes accessible for everybody else as well. So families, pregnant women, people who are temporarily injured, and so on. So yeah, if we start by designing fully inclusive or universal accessible design, then it works for everybody. But I did just want to pick up more critically on the point about Merseyrail. I live in Liverpool. Most of the pictures, well, a number of the pictures on my slides are my local infrastructure. And I hear a lot about these amazing Merseyrail trains that we're getting, but part of the problem is only around 50% of Merseyrail stations are accessible. And the time scale for making all of them accessible, the last I heard, is over about 10 to 15 years. So what we have is these amazing fully accessible trains going through inaccessible stations. A lot of station access is very poor in terms of it's a lift, and if you get off the train and there's no staff and the lift's broken, you're stuck. So, you know, and I just feel like as disabled people, we're often told, you know, oh, this is great, but it will be however many years before the stations are accessible. But we wouldn't say that to any other minority group. We wouldn't say to women, oh, for the next 10 years, you can only use 50% of stations in this region while we sort the others out. But somehow disabled people are always seen as it's okay to leave us behind and to have things that don't work in a way that really wouldn't be accessible for other people. So yeah, beautiful Merseyrail trains coming, but not into accessible stations, unfortunately.
I'm just going to defend Merseyside here a bit. I absolutely get that. And I think if you said that to Steve Rotherham, the mayor, or Liam Robinson, the head of transport, they'd absolutely agree with you. They really would, because I've talked to them. I mean, I think it's worth saying that they have been pushing water uphill in trying to make that network better, but they've been relying on the access, grabbing access for all funding from central government as it's been passing. When they started doing this, Kay, nobody believed that some of the stations that they have put lifts in could have lifts in, because nobody in the rail network believed that it was possible to do that. and they've shown that it is possible, and they've got further and they've gone further and faster than the rest of the rail network, which, as you say, is not good enough. It really isn't good enough, but they've done more than other areas. And my argument is that if you give more powers and funding to the likes of the city region, I mean, it's worth just saying that the mayor has been trying to get control and ownership of the track and stations on of the Merseyrail network from central government, and they haven't even signed the memorandum of understanding yet to even start the discussions. But that's because he wants to go further and faster on this stuff. Merseyrail has staffing at stations from first to last train as part of the devolved administration, devolved system. If you tried the northern trains, you'd be lucky to find any staff on any stations at all, which is the central government, partly central government run franchise. All I'm saying is that Merseyrail have started to do better. It's not good enough, and we need to do much better. And we need to do, the Bus Alliance, which I'm involved in Liverpool, has tried to do better on buses as well. That's still not good enough either. So I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying that I'd mentioned the trains as an example of something where people are trying to do something. It doesn't give you the access that you were talking about.
Thank you both. That's incredibly interesting for someone that doesn't live in the area and doesn't know anything about those trains, but a good insight. I just want to quickly, we're going to go to the audience Q&A in a second. I just want to ask, we'll start with Leo, but a comment from all of you would be good about how you think we can frame the idea of leaving cars at home to the general population without alienating them from a transition to electric vehicles, and also a kind of more, how do we message and create positive comms around alternatives to cars?
So I think this is a problem which is greatly overstated, or there's a perception around it that it's a bigger problem than it really is. That is to say, the idea, the notion of traffic reduction, because the DFT keeps polling people, and they've done surveys just in the last year. They've done 2 big public attitude surveys, which you can find on their website, which the fact that traffic has risen so much on the UK's roads over the last couple of decades is not something that has escaped to the British public. People don't like it, and there is very, very high levels of support for the principle of reducing traffic in the abstract. When you ask people, this isn't not just DFT polling. If you look at polling that mayors have done, I looked at the Bristol polling about priorities of people who live in Bristol. Changes to their streets, what would they like to see? They'd like to see less traffic. Everybody wants to see less traffic. Now, I appreciate there's a bit of cognitive dissonance, because part of the reason they want it is because they're sat in it, which means they are a part of it and they're contributing to it. But there are very high levels of support. 83% of the British public support reduction in traffic, and so it's not, it isn't an either or situation. And actually, I think it's not beyond the British public to appreciate that there is a hierarchy here. And, the very best thing that you can do is to leave your car at home. But that does not negate the fact that we do need all surface transport in the UK to electrify, specifically cars. I'll just leave hydrogen to one side for a minute, but basically, yes, we need to do that, but we also need to reduce traffic. And I don't think there really is a danger of alienating people against EVs in particular, and the transition to EVs. It's simply the case that a lot of the negative externalities of private car dominance over the transport system, the negative externalities that people actually experience, like road traffic danger and, community severance and the rest of the things people don't like, actually won't improve. You will see those memes on social media of traffic jam in picture 1, electric traffic jam in picture 2. They look exactly the same. So this is a problem which is going to continue getting worse until we do something different. And actually, sadly, the switch to EVs is very likely to, and indeed has been modelled to, exacerbate problems with congestion, because drivers respond to a reduction in the marginal cost of driving a car by driving more often, and EVs are 70% cheaper to run. And so as a consequence, when you game that out into the future, you know, you're looking at a 50% increase in congestion. So even if your only strategy for decarbonising transport is switching to EVs, you're still going to need traffic reduction policy to prevent everything becoming gridlock. And the Tony Blair Institute put a paper out on that a month ago, something. Thanks. That is my real answer to that question.
Thanks, Leo. I don't know if Stephen or Kay, you want to come in on that, or we can move to audience Q&A if not.
I suppose just to say quickly, I think if we want people to use other forms of transport other than private cars, it's got to be easy, attractive and pleasant and cost effective and time effective to do so. So people are not going to pick options that make their life more difficult. So I think it's make it all those things and give people the experience of also that other forms of transport also create more connected communities, more sense of social participation, and focus on those benefits as well. But it's got to be easy and accessible and pleasant if we really want people to make that change.
I'd agree with that.
Fab. Okay, I'm going to now hand over to Gat from Green Alliance, who is handling our audience Q&As. So Gat, let us know if there's any interesting questions we can pose to the panelists.
Thanks, Helena. Yeah, lots of great questions in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. One of the questions is from Joe Dodd. How important is the role of clean air zones, such as the Eulers in London, in reducing traffic in our cities?
I don't know if any of you want to go first on that. Leo, yeah.
Obviously, they're pointed at solving a particular problem, and so they are typically geared to basically weed out the worst vehicles, which is a very effective strategy. It's actually a fairly light touch strategy. It's a very effective strategy for reducing particulates and NOx emissions. But they also do represent they do represent curbs to car use per se. And what I would say is that the extent to which they're useful or effective at reducing traffic per se will very much depend and be a function of whether or not they include private cars, because the braver local authorities like Birmingham, who are introducing clean air zones and have actually got on with it and actually done it this summer, have included private cars within the terms of their clean air zone, and that will lead to substantial reductions in traffic. Bath, on the other hand, which has a clean air zone that doesn't include private cars, most of the traffic is private cars. They're not going to see a very big reduction in traffic. They're going to see businesses switch to cleaner vehicles, which is part of the goal, but it's not going to really touch the sides of the traffic problem per se.
Yeah, I think there's a real social justice issue about the way in which ultra low emission zones are implemented. So obviously what it's aiming to get off the road is older cars, diesel. So again, people with older cars are often people on a lower income. Most wheelchair adapted vehicles are diesel, electric versions aren't there. And so what it's really doing is allowing access to cities to people who can afford to switch to an electric or low emissions vehicle. Obviously, if we're doing this to include private cars, and it's again restricting the mobility of people who are already struggling to access mobility in the first place. So I think there needs to be a serious consideration of how that's measured and how effective it is. And also, I mean, again, I'd go back to that point of encouraging people to scrap old cars that are actually still working and may have years of life in them. If it goes into some kind of scrappage scheme, there's a massive carbon footprint from the scrapping and manufacture of cars. So it's like, we're just changing the problem into another area rather than solving it. So I think this constant idea of get rid of old stuff and rebuild it is not really solving our climate problems. So I think we need to think more broadly about it, and much more from a social justice point of view, before we sort of blanket welcome things like ultra low emission zones.
I'd really like to come back just in defence of Birmingham in this case, because Birmingham have been very alive to this, you know, and they've also suffered from the council leaders in Birmingham have suffered from very unhelpful and poorly informed commentary from their local MPs, you know, who've done things like call the Birmingham Clean Air Zone a tax on the poor and things. Now, what Birmingham have done is introduce a whole range of mitigation measures because they're alive to exactly the problem that you just described. You know, the costs of a clean air zone don't fall on Tesla drivers, you know, and I appreciate that's the point that you're making, Kay. But actually, when you look at who are the demographics who will be most affected by the clean air zone in Birmingham, it is wealthier Birmingham residents and people who live in the wider West Midlands region who will predominantly be paying the charge. And what they've actually gone to the lengths that if you are earning under 30 grand, you get an exemption for a couple of years. So there's exemptions for disabled people. So anyone disabled is not coming in to pay the clean air zone. But actually, they've also said if you live or you work in Birmingham and you rely on using your car, and you make less than 30 grand. Now the average salary in Birmingham is more like 25, right? So they've been very, very conscious of this as a critique, and actually lots of the things that Birmingham have done as mitigation measures to deal with these legitimate concerns can act as a lesson to other local authorities, because actually the social justice, the negative social justice impacts of what Birmingham have done will be very, very small, and most of the tab here is going to be picked up by richer West Midlands residents who didn't need to be driving in the first place. It's exemplary.
I'd also just mentioned that in Coventry, which is part of this, there's mobility credits have been offered, so that people are offered money to that if they scrap an old car, they get credits for using alternatives, buses and trains and so on. So they have thought about this. I noticed a comment about only the rich using cars. That's generally true. It is mostly there's a lot of poorer people who can't afford to use cars at all, and they're often living in areas with some of the worst pollution. So that's actually they don't have cars and they have the worst pollution, and so they should get benefits from this. But I'd accept with Kay, there are some people who will suffer, and in London and in Birmingham there have been measures to try and do something about that. So I think it's optional. I'd just give a shout out to Nottingham here, actually, because Leo said, well, no city has reached decent air quality. Nottingham is close to that, and they're close to it because they didn't need to do a clean air zone. They didn't need to do a clean air zone because they've already got a workplace parking levy, and the workplace parking levy has been in place now for, I think, nearly 10 years, and that charges people at workplace with more than 10 parking spaces at work, employers with parking spaces at work. Some of them pass it on, some of them don't. The money has been used to buy lines 2 and 3 of their tram network, to buy a lot of extra bus services, and to redo the city's railway station. So that's a genuine case where the money's been ring-fenced for better transport services. The Nottingham Link system, which, by the way, I think all the buses on that are accessible, but I haven't checked it. So so that kind of package, and that's enabled Nottingham to avoid having to introduce clean air zones, because that package is already in place.
Thank you all. I think that says a lot about how we design these schemes and programmes. There's lots of different ways to do it, and making sure it's inclusive of everybody is incredibly important. I think we're going to try and squeeze 2 more questions in. We'll go for one, and if we run out of time, then we'll just stick with one. Agat?
Thanks, Helena. Yeah, I've got 2 questions, one on inclusivity and one on road building and planning. So the first one is, what would your advice be to local and transport planners to make active travel more inclusive to everyone? So if you could just give your top piece of advice, that would be great.
We'll start with Kay and then we'll go around. So yeah, just your top piece of advice.
Okay, I'll give you a top 3. LTM 120, which is government, Wheels for Wellbeing's Inclusive Cycle Design Guide, Transports for All's 7-point Equal Pavements Pledge.
Thank you. Stephen?
I would go for e-bike support and 20 miles an hour zones in on urban roads as a way into this, but support for e-bikes so that they're more accessible, and with the cycle parking and cycle infrastructure that goes with them, because I think that can be genuinely inclusive.
Fab. And Leo?
Well, I don't disagree. You know, LTN 21 is the new guidance, new statutory guidance for infrastructure, which would mean, if it were followed everywhere, that it would be accessible. And I would have mentioned that as well. So I agree with Kay, and I absolutely agree with Stephen too. Micromobility is something I wish we'd had more time to talk about it actually in this session, because these new emerging forms of mobility are much less expensive than cars, right? So they're intrinsically more accessible to people across the income spectrum. You know, the half of households in the poorest fifth who simply cannot access, who can't afford to access a vehicle of their own. Actually, micromobility brings vehicles into the viable zone for people who are on low incomes. And the fascinating thing about them, so e-bikes in particular, but to some extent e-scooters, e-cargo bikes as well, all of the things which are in this new emerging vehicle class are not only much cheaper than other alternatives for motorized transport, private motorized transport, they also have a much longer range than has been possible in the past for bikes. So viable journeys that could be switched from cars to cycling. Actually, the trip length people are prepared to tolerate on bikes on average is relatively small. But once you're on an e-bike, you're flying along. The average cycle commute in Copenhagen is 14 kilometers now, right? And that's because of a combination of e-bike uptake and building infrastructure to accommodate this new emerging vehicle class. So I would love to speak about micromobility more, because you can integrate that then with public transport as well. If you're able to take your e-scooter on a train or a bus, that just completely changes, that multimodality completely changes what becomes possible in terms of an end-to-end journey without using a private car.
Thank you all. We're going to just squeeze in one final question really quickly. Agat?
Thank you, Helena. This is a question from Chris Todd, and it says, without a significant shift in funding, so from roads to sustainable transport, and a clamp down on car-based development, is traffic reduction achievable? And I thought, Stephen, if you could give a really quick answer to that'd be great.
We need to do those things. We need to shift the funding. I very much like the term "putting roads on a diet" that the No Place Left Behind Commission used. I thought it was a really good way of putting it. So yes, we do need to do those things. We can start now. There are things we can do now, but we will be pushing water uphill unless we do the things. We stop the cowpat developments that Chris refers to, and change and reallocate funding.
Thank you, and thank you to Agat for managing those questions for us. So we've just got a few minutes left. I'd love to hear a kind of 1-minute closing statement from all of you. We'll go around as we did at the beginning, and we'll start with Leo. If you could just keep it really brief so we can finish on time.
Thanks, Helena. I'll do my best. I'm Director of Innovation at Possible, and so I want to talk about something that we are working on, which is a potential solution. It's not happening anywhere at the moment, but it's a potential solution. A very large proportion of the vehicle miles driven in the UK are made by a very small proportion of the trips, because most trips are very short and can be easily switched to other things. But the trips which are much longer account for a disproportionate share of all the miles driven. These are very difficult problems to solve. Unlike in cities where short trips you can just walk, cycle, it's much harder to do that. We're working with Centre for Sustainable Road Freight on E-Motorways, which is where you string catenary cable along the inside lane of a motorway, and lorries use pantographs on the top to power themselves along that. Now, the problem that lorries face, which is their duty cycles are too large for batteries. If you just do it with a battery, you end up with half the truck being a battery. Very similar to the same problems that coaches and buses face. So if you think about trams and trolley buses in particular, so a trolley bus is a half tram, half bus. It's got a pantograph on the top. It's powered by cables. Combine that with new battery technology so that you don't have to run on the wires all of the time. It means that you can just string cable along the easy, long, straight sections of the motorway. You don't need to worry about junctions, and you don't need to worry about either end of the trip because there's a battery on board that can do that. Then you can dedicate a lane of motorway to a combination of freight and mass transit. So we're talking about bus rapid transit, basically a bus lane down the motorway, which has lorries and coaches in it, and is capable of attracting people out of their cars because you will no longer be sat in traffic. You will travel at a consistent speed. You'll know exactly when you're going to arrive. It would radically change the attractiveness of coach travel, which at the moment in the UK is very much the preserve of people at the bottom of the income spectrum. Nobody chooses to do it because if you do get on a coach, you will sit in traffic that you didn't cause, that was caused by all the people in their private cars. So dedicate a lane of the motorway to bus rapid transit, electrify the whole thing. And I'm really excited by that as a possible approach to making a lot of the vehicle emissions from cars go away in the UK. I'm done.
Thanks, Leo. Kay?
Thanks. So Wales for Wellbeing want to see cycling, active travel and public transport policy developed from an ethos of mobility justice. This means targeting resources and provision, as I've already said, towards those who have the least mobility options, rather than increasing provision for those who already enjoy the most mobility privilege, both demographically and regionally, as is currently the case. Without a focus on mobility justice, traffic reduction and green transport resources will design in further exclusion of disabled people and other minoritised groups who already face the most barriers to basic mobilities, let alone green options. And this has to be done from the outset, otherwise we end up creating plans and ideas that we then notice afterwards are inaccessible, and we start trying to tag things on afterwards, which are never effective solutions and which always deter people from using them. So there's an expression that there can be no climate justice without social justice. And so that demands that all green transport and active travel in policy, practice, and implementation has at its foundation an understanding and realisation of mobility justice. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Kay. And Stephen, over to you.
I'll have to be quick. I just point out and say that we can cut traffic. We must cut traffic and link it to the social justice agenda that Kay has just outlined. We can do that, and that actually some of the things we've discussed, much better spatial planning that doesn't rely on everybody having 2 or 3 cars, which is how a lot of states are, reallocating funding from a few big road schemes to lots of to active and sustainable travel, changing the cost base of transport, but also the starting from now, and things like tackling commuting are things that you can do that can start now, and there are things that can be done now to tackle to make it less necessary to reduce car dependence, even in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all the attendees who asked questions. Sorry we couldn't get around to all of them, and sorry we've run over by a couple of minutes, but thank you very much and have a lovely day. Bye.